welcome everybody. Today, Cristal and I are going to talk about adapting, remixing, and curating OERs. We're going to introduce ourselves in just a second, but I wanted to get to know everybody who's here today first. So I'm going to drop a link into the chat, or you can scan this QR code. There's just two questions about, where you're from. We're coming here from different colleges today, and also about your experience with OER. I'll introduce myself. My name is Stephanie Coffman. I work at Clovis Community College. I'm a biology instructor. I also am really passionate about OER. I'm our liaison to the state, and Cristal is here with me today as well. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. So hi, everyone. My name is Cristal Machuca Marquez. I am a recently new hire full-time instructor for Clovis Community College as of last year. However, I've already had some experience in adopting OERs into my classrooms. So that's why I'm here helping Stephanie with her presentation. Other things that I would like to say, if you have any concerns, that's okay. If you feel a little bit overwhelmed, that's okay, because I understand that there's a lot of content and material when it comes to OERs. So as you're getting used to the new terminology, the licenses, and anything that we're talking about, feel free to ask questions, and also know that it's just a learning experience. So even after this hour, you probably won't, be an expert on it, but you'll have the fundamental skills to at least get started.
Okay. Yeah, and Cristal's not just here helping. She's an expert in Creative Commons because she finished the course. So she's very knowledgeable about the topic.
I will say, even with the training, you still have to bookmark a few things, go back, refresh your mind on the licenses, see what you can and cannot do. So it's an ongoing skill that you need to practice and hone in, but it's worthwhile, I would say.
All right, so we're going to start with a little introduction. We'll talk a little bit about Creative Commons licensing. It's kind of a crash course. It's not the focus, but we need to understand them in order to talk about adapting and remixing. Number 3, curating OERs. And then we're going to go through some scenarios and sort of discuss what we think would be appropriate in those different scenarios. And hopefully we have a lot of time for discussions and questions as well. I'm going to try to keep my eye on the chat. If you guys for attendance could put your name in the chat and also which college you're coming from, that would be helpful as well. All right, anything you want to add, Cristal, before we get started with the first part?
No, I think we're good. We're good to go. I also put in the chat just what you all shall include, so name and college, and that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so briefly, you guys scored pretty high on this one. What is OER? They are open educational resources, things that you can use for teaching that specifically carry an open license that allows you to reuse them as much as you want. They're shared. They're not just anything out there that's free or anything out there that's digital. There are a lot of things out there that are free to use online that are copyrighted materials. Those are not same as an open educational resource. OERs specifically have an open license on them. OERs, by definition, have to have these 5 things. We call them the 5 R's of OER. You have to be able to reuse them. So you don't need to ask the person who made them permission. You can just reuse them. Retain them so you can keep a copy for yourself. You should be able to revise them, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and remix them, another thing we'll be talking about today. You should also be able to redistribute, like make copies to send to your students. Some benefits of using an OER textbook. Most of the time, OER gets talked about in terms of the cost to students for textbooks, which is an absolutely wonderful benefit of having an OER textbook. It costs students less to get their education and to meet their goals. But there are also lots of other benefits to having an OER textbook. One of them is access. All your students will start off at the same place on the first day of class, at least in terms of having their course materials. You won't have students who don't have their materials yet. Student success, students are less likely to drop an OER course than they are to drop a course with a traditional textbook. And a couple of the things we're going to be talking about today, so I won't go into them in too much detail, but OER also allows for adaptability. You can edit your textbook, creativity. This is my favorite part. I love getting creative and making new things and putting together different things to create something new that I think is going to get my students' attention. And also you can update your books with the most current research and things that are happening right now in your field. So I want to use a little bit of analogy to explain how powerful OER can be when you take advantage of these other features of OER. It's common to adopt an OER textbook as sort of a replacement for a traditional textbook you were using from a publisher and kind of just use it in the same way. And so the analogy I want to use is the analogy of phones, right? We used to have phones like this flip phone or even just your landline that were really only a one-job thing. You could talk to people on them. Maybe you had like a snake game on there, but really you use this to communicate with other people, to talk to them. And then came the iPhone. And when people bought the iPhones at the beginning, a lot of people initially just used their iPhone like they used their old phone. They talked to people, they texted. But I think all of us know that in the decades since then, we now use our cell phones for everything, right? So in the beginning, when cell phones first came out, that's what people used them for. They thought of them as just a replacement for their old phones. Talk to people, text people. But that's pretty boring when you could be doing things like going out and catching Pokemon, right? Or I use my phone mostly for taking pictures of my kids and stuff like that. So there's a lot of capabilities here. This relates to OER. It's kind of the idea that when you get an OER textbook, you could just replace your traditional publisher's textbook and use it the same way you would a regular textbook. Or you could take advantage of some of these other features of OERs and make something even cooler, right? There's a lot of other powerful things you can do with OER if you take advantage of the open licensing components. All right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Creative Commons licenses. This is going to be a crash course. I know there was a talk on Tuesday that was more in depth on Creative Commons licenses, and I believe that is on YouTube, so you guys can watch that one still. Creative Commons licenses are the most common type of open license. I like this figure because a lot of us are familiar with copyright and this idea of all rights reserved, right? And Creative Commons kind of fall in the middle of a traditional copyrighted work and something that's in the public domain, which a lot of people are also familiar with, where there are no rights reserved. These are kind of the two opposite ends of the spectrum. Creative Commons licenses fall in the middle, and we call it some rights reserved, right? What that means with the Creative Commons license is that you are still the copyright holder of that work. It still belongs to you, and you are still the author of it. People can't use it without attributing it back to you. However, you waive some of your rights. For example, particularly rights that allow you to share the work. So you waive rights, for example, letting people use it without asking you, right? And there are different permissions that you can give, different specifications. There's actually 6 different licenses that you can choose from. So it kind of fits here in the middle. Oops. There are 6 Creative Commons licenses. I'll go over quickly just the 4 elements that make up those licenses. I mentioned before that it's some rights reserved, but you as the author of the work get to choose which rights you are reserving and which ones you would like to sort of waive, if you want to think of it that way. All of the Creative Commons licenses have this first element, this by element, and this is called the attribution element. There aren't any Creative Commons licenses that don't have this. So all 6 licenses require that you always attribute the author of the work. Even if you're allowed to use it for free, you have to tell people where you got it from and give them credit for the work that they did to create that thing. There's also a share alike component you can add if you want. This is an SA component. This one tells the user how any derivatives of that work should be licensed. And we're going to be talking about adapting today. So share alike would mean if you are making an adaptation of the work, you have to use that same license on the future works. Non-commercial is a kind of actually a popular one in education. It's the NC component. This means that your work, people can use it, they can adapt it, they can revise it, but they cannot use it for commercial reasons. So it has to be only for non-commercial use, which education falls, of course, under non-commercial use. The fourth component is the ND or no derivatives. This one is actually not considered an OER, but because it doesn't actually allow for all 5 of those things, of the 5 R's that we talked about. But this one says that you can use the original work, you can make copies of it and give them to your students, but you can't adapt or remix these works. All right. I know that's a lot. We'll kind of go back to some of these, but they are represented by these little symbols that you'll see throughout the talk. The little person is attribution. The circle is keeping everything in the same license or share alike. This one is non-commercial with the money sign. That one's easy. And then the equal sign is the no derivatives, basically saying that anything that comes has to be the same, right? You can't change it. All right, I'm going to pass it off to Cristal to talk about remixing and adapting.
Thank you, Stephanie. All right, Stephanie, can you advance 1 over? Thank you. Okay, so the first thing is just kind of addressing the big why. So why take the time to adapt or remix a book, especially if you already found an OER that perhaps you already like, you've adopted, you're using it, it works great. So this is some information to kind of keep in mind. The first one being that information, such as the examples that you find on your OERs, we kind of owe it to our students to make sure that we're using current information and perhaps current examples. So specifically for my discipline, speaking from experience, something that I've done is that even though I use OERs, as I'm talking to my students, I try and change the examples that we're using. So we talk a lot about social and political movements that are happening. And so anything that's happened within the last 6 months to a year, I'm like, hey, I want to talk about that. It's current, it's happening. How can we incorporate this into the classroom? And so we know that with a traditional book that's published, if you are using one, that takes years and it takes time to eventually see the examples that you want to talk about written out in a published book. The second thing that we should mention is that we should try and tailor and improve the content so it has more of a local feel. So what this means is you know your students best, you know the community that we're working under, we're all part of the same district. And so perhaps this goes back to number 1, perhaps you want to incorporate examples or information that ties to the specific demographics of our students. And so sure, if you use an OER and you've adopted one, it might be great, but perhaps you're not getting a little bit of that local feel because the examples are not as relevant, or perhaps, again, we're not focusing on the demographics of our students. So this is a great opportunity for you to adapt and remix an OER so that you have more of, again, that local feel, and also just catering to the needs of your learners. So if you are more of an experienced teacher and you've been here for quite some time, perhaps you picked up on a few things that work or that don't work. And so you want to make sure that you are also, being inclusive a little bit and letting your students know, like, hey, this is the material that we're reading, but also, hey, there's a lot of diverse perspectives on here too. And so that's your ability to add that perspective. And then lastly, so when we modify OERs, it also allows us to just be offer things in a more accessible format for our students. So simply perhaps taking an OER and translating it to a different language, that would still count as adapting, right? Or perhaps I've seen a few textbooks where there are interactive features. So perhaps as they're reading, there are some questions that they can answer within the textbook if it's an online textbook. And there's also sometimes simulations that are included. And so if we want to modify those simulations for accessibility reasons, we can do that. And so these are some things that we can be mindful of as we're moving forward. And hopefully, right, this is the selling part for you all, like why should you use an OER? So keeping these things in mind, that is why we should adapt and revise. All right, so the next slide, Stephanie, thank you. Okay, so adapting and remixing. So when we talk about remixing, a lot of us sometimes use these words interchangeably because sometimes it's hard to do one without by default doing the other. So for remixing, this is when we mix materials from different sources to create something new. So for example, you might combine information from multiple OER sources to create one artifact, so such as one book chapter, or maybe revising and creating a new homework assignment. For adapting or revising, it's like remixing, but we emphasize more that there's more of your contribution for original material. So original material is incorporated into the OER sources that you're using. So perhaps you're adapting a lab assignment to use, or to use samples used specifically for your class. So like I mentioned before, with adapting and remixing, sometimes it's kind of difficult to do one without default doing the other. But I would emphasize that adapting, we're incorporating more of our original work into that OER. All right, next slide, Stephanie. Okay, so a visual representation of remixing and adapting. So this is a pretty frequent analogy that we like to use, and so we use that of making a smoothie. So something to be mindful of is that when we make a smoothie, there are a lot of different components and fruits that we use, but overall, when we have the one smoothie completed, it's kind of hard to see what went into that smoothie because, right, you blended everything together and it so seamlessly created a whole new product. And so that's a great way of kind of understanding the differences between remixing and adapting. The other thing to note here, though, is if you take a close look, you'll see if we're treating the fruits and vegetables as different OER sources, they each still have their own specific license, right? So when you're creating a new work, you have to be mindful of the licensing of the other works that you're using. And so by default, we say that the most restrictive license, so the OER or the source that you're pulling with the most restrictive license, that's probably by default what your new product should have because, right, some licenses are compatible and others are not. All right, Stephanie, the next slide. Or was there anything you wanted to add here? No?
Maybe just that the smoothie is a whole new, brand new thing that isn't a pineapple or an orange. But yeah, it's great.
And now come into play with the other analogy we bring up later about the basket with the fruits, because again, the smoothie, you can't really tell what went into it. We just treat it as a whole new product. So to recap, a few other things to consider. So when you're adapting or remixing, like I mentioned before, you need to consider the licenses of the works that you're using. This will determine the license that you're going to use. And then for non-derivative, it's not an OER and it's not open for adapting or remixing. So that's probably one of the most restrictive. It basically means you can redistribute the work as originally put together, but you can't necessarily adapt it and make it your own. Licensing with SA, so it requires, it's a similar license, and so we'll get into that in a little bit. And it's also highly recommended that when we use a work with the non-commercial license, that you also choose a license that has non-commercial. So you'll notice that some licenses, technically, legally, you can do it. It's just probably not the most ethical. And so Stephanie will talk about that in a little bit. All right, so to kind of put this more in a visual chart, we have the adapter's license chart here. And so this is like if you are wanting to adapt one piece of work, like let's say I have one OER that I'm using instead of 2 or 3, there's just this one OER that I'm using. I look at what the original license was for that work. And then on the chart over here where it says adapter's license, that can tell me what I can do with that work. And so, for example, anything that's in the public domain, that's the easiest to work with, because if we look at public domain and we go across the board, we'll see green because if it's in the public domain, that means that there are no rights really attached to it. It's anyone can use it, adapt it, and revise it. So I get to choose that original work. I may adapt a few things, I may add to it. And if I redistribute it and I want to attach a new license to it, I definitely can if it's in the public domain, right? Stephanie, can we move on to the next slide? Okay, and then when it comes to remixing, so again, I'm more of a visual learner, and I will say that even though I've taken the course and I've learned about the different licenses, it just makes more sense to have a copy of this. I have it bookmarked as well. And so when I'm thinking about what licenses are compatible, I just cross-reference, and if it has the little green check mark, then I know I'm good to go. If it has the X, so like we mentioned before, the non-derivative being the most restrictive, that lets me know what I can and cannot do there. Stephanie, would you like to add anything to the slide? No? Okay.
I think we are going a little faster than we thought. So if we want, we can have some questions before we talk about curating and collections.
Yeah, I think a good little mental break would be nice. 30 seconds to kind of take all that in.
Yeah, but if you have any questions so far, go ahead and drop them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself.
I have a question. I was thinking about rearranging a textbook and just moving parts of chapters around. Do I have to have a special license to do that? Do I have to license it for that?
Well, if you're using one textbook and rearranging it, then everything in that textbook is going to have probably just the license, the original license, right? But you might end up adding new things to it, which would make it an adaptation. So a lot of times, kind of like Cristal mentioned, we might be like, I'm going to remix this book by mixing it up, or by, getting two books and mixing the chapters together. And then after we do that remixing, we end up doing adapting because it doesn't flow anymore. So there's a good chance, even if you do that, you're going to end up also adapting. And then you would want to use this first chart to figure out that whatever this is going to be the license of the work you are starting with. So whatever book it is, it has one of these OER licenses or Creative Commons licenses. And then you would just want to make sure you're choosing a license up here that's compatible. This would be the license you're putting on your new work, your new adaptation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So Grace asked, if an image has an ND license, does that mean it can't be mixed into an original document like a lab report, or does that just mean the image can't be edited in any way? That's a really good question. Generally with images, they retain the license that they already had, and so you are not modifying them. And even if you wrote a chapter and all by yourself, if you wrote the whole chapter and you put a specific license on your new chapter, and the only thing in there that you didn't make was an image, that image always has the license of its original author, right? It's always going to be there. So that would be okay. You would just want to make it really clear and put that license, I would say, in the caption of the image, but you would not be able to edit the image at all. That's a good question. Any other questions? Are we ready to move on? All right, so the next part is, sorry. We're going to talk a little bit about curating OERs and making a collection. So sometimes, as we can see on this chart, we might want to use things that are not compatible with each other. And in that, we can't remix those, but we can still put them together in a collection. And an example of that might be if you had something like a CC by SA share alike license here. Any work that uses this has to have that same license on it, right? But that's also true of this one, CC by and CSA. Everything has to have that license on it. So if you look at where these intersect, they're not compatible with one another. So you wouldn't be able to remix those two together, but you would be able to make a collection. And there's lots of other reasons people make collections besides just conflicting licenses. Collection is going to be grouping, and I think we kind of know what a collection is, but it's the same thing here. It's a grouping of separate works. So instead of mixing all the works together, you're taking separate works and each of them is staying separate. You're just putting them into a collection. So a great example would be a book of poems, right? Every poem has its own author and its own license, whatever that might be. And you're not making adaptations of them. You're just leaving them originally as they are and putting them together in a collection. So this could be a collection of unedited OER artifacts, perhaps combined into your Canvas course. Maybe you have a collection of different readings that you collected from different places, different authors, different licenses. That would be an example of a collection. In a collection, you can use a no derivative work. So this is one way that you could include it. Like Cristal mentioned, if it has a no derivative, you can still use it for free in your class, but you just can't make adaptations or edits. So let's think about our fruits again. In this case, in our previous example, all of the fruits got thrown in the blender together. And the idea is you come up with this new piece of work where you can't tell where one of the old ones started and the new ones begin, or another one begins. In this case, we're going to keep each one of those fruits still separate. We're not going to put them together. So our analogy to continue on with the fruits would be a fruit basket instead of a smoothie. So here we have different fruits. They're all apples, but we have different apples. It's an apple basket, and each apple has its own license on it, right? And that is not going to change. These are going to stay separate apples. We're not smashing them together, and they're each going to retain their own license. So you can see that one of the apples has that no derivative element on it, and that is fine because you're not editing it. You're leaving it as is. You might add a license to any new things you add to this collection. For example, you might add an introduction chapter before your collection, or you might add a little bit before each of the poems that give context to why the students are reading this poem. And that could have whatever license you wanted because you are the creator of that. So in this example, this analogy, that is the basket. Right? The basket is the collection you have created to hold all of these fruits together.
And then Stephanie, we got a question. So
in the chat.
Oh, sorry. Oh, go ahead, Stephanie. You were about to read it.
Thank you. Yeah, can a collection be created from materials accessible through the library and databases such as AST or JSTOR? In your Canvas course, yes, right? If you were going to put this out in a public OER repository, though, I would say all the things in your collection would have to be OER, but within your Canvas course, and you can definitely include those in there. All right, do we have any questions about collections, OER, or remixing, adapting, any of these things? Are we ready to see what we learned? All right, I'm going to let Cristal take over.
Okay, so for the first scenario, I believe this is the one with Jackie. Yep. So let's say that Jackie wants to provide a handout with different speech examples that her students can watch for their public speaking course. She is using different OERs, so she decides to pull speeches that were referenced throughout the 4 different OER books that she used. So is she adapting, remixing, or curating? And you can write it in the chat. Yes. So if we're not adding anything new, if me as an instructor, I'm like, hey, I really like these examples from these different books. Let me go ahead and pull those examples and then put them together into one handout that I can give to my students. That would be considered curating. So you're not adding any new or original work. Instead, you're providing one handout. You're providing the information as it was. You're just now redistributing to your classmates or your students, I should say.
All right, scenario 2. A colleague wants to make an adaptation of a worksheet they found that is licensed CC by NC, that's non-commercial. They want to license their new adaptation CC by. What advice would you give your colleague? So let's take at least a minute to think about this one. And we've got the chart over here. Oops, I'm sorry. The chart over here to remind you of what the different elements mean. So Catherine says legally the license would have to be CC by NC. John agrees. They can't alter the original work. CC by, that's what she wants to do. Yeah, you can adapt a CC by non-commercial, right? Only the non-derivative ones prevent you from making any kind of adaptation. The NC is more about what the use might be. So this one is kind of a tricky one. This is one of those ones that was yellow in the chart that Cristal showed. You can license legally a new work that was as CC by, even though the original work was CC by NC, but it is not recommended. And it is not recommended for a couple reasons. One of the reasons being just that the original author's intent is non-commercial. So, it's a nice thing to do to honor that and also put the NC on there, right? Also going by just the guidelines of picking the stricter of the two, right? Not going looser than what the original author had. The other reason is that adaptations after many reiterations and many different authors can get very convoluted. You cannot actually change the license of their work. That means in your adaptation that you're creating, only the new elements you are adding would carry this new CC by license. All the stuff that the original author wrote is still non-commercial, right? So it makes a very strange new product where you end up with parts of it that are non-commercial and parts of them that are commercial, and who knows where those lines are drawn, right? You'd have to go find the original and compare, right? So it gets really murky if you keep doing that. So if we go here, you can see on the adapter's license chart, if you are starting with something that is over here on the left hand, this is the original work, CC by NC, this box is yellow, right? It's not recommended. It's better to choose one of these that still has the non-commercial element on it. You could make it stricter if you want, but making it less strict is not advised. Couldn't the colleague simply, you could just do an NC license for the new adaptations. That would be the best thing to do, or something stricter if you wanted. You could do that too. All right. Does anybody have any questions about this one actually really quick? All right, pass it back to Cristal.
So this is our last scenario. So let's say that Raphael wants to remix and adapt two different works. One is licensed CC by ND and the other is licensed CC by SA. What advice would you give to Raphael? And so I'll give you a second to think about it. And if you think you know what you would say, write that in the chat. I'll give it another second, but it might be helpful to look at the description for each one. So remember we talked about non-derivative work. So others can only copy, distribute, display, or perform verbatim copies of your work, but CC by SA, that is the share alike. So others can distribute your work only under a license identical to the one that you have chosen for your work. So can the two overlap? And then he can remix a non-derivative work. Sorry, cannot. Correct. So it was a little bit of a trick question, but yes. So if you have the non-derivative on your license, you basically can redistribute that same exact verbatim copy of work. You just cannot modify it or adapt it. So perhaps someone decided, hypothetically, I wrote an OER. I would love to share it with my colleagues, with my students. I want them to have access to it. but you know what, I don't feel comfortable with you making changes and revising it. I don't feel comfortable with you maybe selling it. So I'm going to add the non-derivative work. So it's basically me sharing for funsies and for fun, but I'm not comfortable with you changing my work. So if it's non-derivative, usually it's pretty restrictive. Okay, and then on this slide, we're just going back to the different compatible licenses. So again, I say that the visuals help more than the definitions because you're having to cross-reference. So this is a good, easy way of looking at if your work and the other work that you want to combine, if you're able to do so.
Yeah, I don't think non-derivatives aren't that common. I mean, they're not OERs, so you're not going to see them created in the educational setting, but you will see them created other places and you can definitely use them. A lot of images or infographics might have non-derivatives on them, especially maybe figures and stuff like that, because people don't want others to change the meaning of the figure that they had created. Do you guys have any questions about license compatibility or how these guys can fit together?
I have a question. So if we're going to try and create a textbook, the easiest thing would be to have like a CC by share alike. Like that's the best, right? Pretty much. And then non-commercial would be okay because we're a college.
So
but
yeah, or just CC BY is the most open Creative Commons license, is a CC BY license. So most textbooks out there, like OpenStax, those are all CC BY licenses. A lot of educational places will put the NC on it. Personally, I used to be a big fan of the SA share alike. Whenever I made things, I would add a share alike license to it, but I stopped doing that because of the compatibility issues of share alike licenses. They have more. So here's just CC by share alike. They have more incompatibilities than either CC by itself or CC by NC does. So my own personal preference was to stop using that and just use either the CC by or the CC by NC for my own things that I'm creating. But that's the nice thing about these licenses, is that every individual can decide what they want and what they're comfortable with, how they're comfortable with their work being shared. Because once you do put a Creative Commons license on there, people can use it. You can't take it back. You can't be like, never mind. You can take it off future versions, but once it's out there, it's out there. Any other questions?
Stephanie, I might have a question regarding NC. So I know for NC, it's non-commercial, so you're not allowed any monetary compensation, right? So what if our students, I know it's been mentioned that Clovis Community, they can print the book, the library, not the library, the bookstore, they'll be able to print the book. That's completely fine, right? They can still print it as long as Clovis Community is not making any money off it.
Yes, so they can still get a print copy, and the non-commercial aspect is focused mostly on the use of the material. You are not using that textbook for commercial purposes. So even though the bookstore is going to make a little bit of money printing that for your student, it is still okay because the use of that is non-commercial, right? Of course, you want to make sure that it's a reasonable amount of money, but our bookstore is very good at that. I think it's very affordable, the printed copies. And I think it's important to put a printed copy there if you can, so that students can purchase that if they need a physical copy instead of a digital copy.
Thank you.
Just a real quick question. Generally speaking, what would be a typical cost of a textbook that's printed at or by the bookstore, that one of these OER books?
It's going to depend on the campuses. I know that ours is very affordable. The last one we sent over there was $11. Yeah, so it's a lot. Obviously, it's going to also depend how big book is. This was a communication studies book.
Right. Was this the Interp book with Anna Martinez Stephanie?
Yeah, it was only $11, which was way cheaper than going to Kinko's, right? Because that will cost your students a lot more if they take your book to Kinko's. So. All right, lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about attributions, just one slide, because all of the Creative Commons licenses require attribution. Even if you're just using an OER, but you're not adapting it, you always have to attribute where it came from. That's one of the principal things. The authors should always get credit for the work that they did. So all Creative Commons licenses require an attribution. If you are making an adaptation or remixing things, you need to make those attributions back to those original works. So I have a link here to an attribution builder, but here is what an attribution might look like. This is an image of some cupcakes. And the attribution has the title of the work. It actually links to the work. So the person gets, so you can always see that original work, the author, and then the license of that work with a link to the license of that work, right? So those are the things you always need: the title, the author, the license, and hopefully links if you can. If you were to make a derivative of this, so you were to adapt it, then you would put your new license on it, right? So here they've 90fied, I guess this is what colors look like in the 90s. They've 90fied this image. So now they have a new title. This is the title they are giving their new work, 90fied. Is a derivative of, and then it's going to link back to that original work so that anybody who's seeing this work can also see the original work. It still has the author, it has the original license, and then it has the new license of the work, right? Which is they kept it the same, and then you would put your name there, right? So the attribution really helps. I mean, the attribution builder really helps. The attribution is essential. You must do that. All right, so this slide just has some resources for you: best practices for attributions, an attribution builder. This is a Creative Commons textbook. So this is from the course that Cristal and I took, but they have very succinct textbook chapters about licenses, adaptations, collections, and they're very there's not a lot of fluff, so they're pretty easy to read quickly and get the information that you need. These are some examples of OER adaptations and collections. We've also included the Academic Senate for the California Community Colleges, their OERI Canvas repositories, which has a bunch of different discipline-specific OERs, and our OER LibGuide at Clovis. I think other schools might have their own as well. All right, so we finished a little bit early, but that just means we have plenty of time for questions and discussions.
Before questions and discussions, I will say that from the last slide with all the different links, I personally really like using the Creative Commons textbook link. So that redirects you to a Canvas shell. And then I bookmark that. It does a great job of having different modules for different disciplines. So you can see what other instructors are already using. And so something that I do is there are 2 OERs that I really like for my public speaking class. And so I jump between both of them and I let my students know right from the start, from the get-go, like, hey, we're using those 2 OERs. They're available both online if you want to bookmark them, but you can also download it as a PDF for those students that want to work offline. And then I let them know, like, this week we're reading this chapter from this book, and this week we're reading this chapter from this book.
Does anybody have any examples of remixing or adaptations or collections that they've made for their classes?
Not yet.
Yeah. I find remixing in science to be very useful because you can take things from like the textbook and then from labs, different lab activities, and put them all together into a new thing. And then add your own things too and make them so they actually fit your lab spaces.
We'll stay here if anyone has any questions, but if you're good to go, we appreciate you being here and your time. So thank you.
Thank you very much.